Welcome to What in the World, a project initiated by Hungry for Life International. Today's podcast is titled Mary's Story Part 1, and Jess will be interviewing Mary Martz. So grab your headphones, sit back, relax, and listen as they talk about what it was like for her family to navigate their faith under communism.
Okay, welcome back to another week of What in the World, the Hungry for Life podcast. This week, we have another staff member being interviewed, and her story is extremely compelling, and so compelling that we actually broke it into two parts. So stay tuned for part 2. You won't want to miss it. I'd like to welcome Mary Martz.
Well,
Hi,
thanks
Mary.
for having me. Hi.
All right. Before I introduce the topic, which is on the title of this podcast, so people already know, but can you tell us how long you've been at Hungry for Life and what you do here?
I started Hungry for Life volunteering from the year that Hungry for Life existed. I volunteered for 8 years, just translating, leading teams to Ukraine. And then in 2014, I became a staff, and I am a project manager. I manage projects in Ukraine.
Yeah. And who's your boss?
Well, now it's Jason, but
Oh, right.
but my previous boss was my husband.
Yeah.
So that was a humble pie to feed. But
So yeah,
we did
Mary
it.
Mary is married to our director of operations, Chad, and yeah, one of the 4 married couples here on staff at Hungry for Life. So
Yes.
Okay, so Mary is, as you mentioned, you're the project manager for Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and Mary is very closely connected with our field partners in Ukraine. So close that they share DNA.
Yeah.
They are her family. And in this episode, we're going to dissect the situation in Ukraine and what it was like growing up under communism. Hot topic. So before we get into all that, Mary, how did you end up in Canada? And how many of your siblings, where is your family all? Are some in Ukraine? Are some here with you?
Yeah, we're kind of international family. So I live in Canada. I have 2 sisters that live in the United States. I have a brother who lives in Russia. And all the rest of my siblings live in Ukraine, but we have a Dutch sister-in-law. We have a sister-in-law that is from Belarus. So, yeah, it's quite international.
Nice.
Yes.
Multicultural family. Okay, so jumping into this topic of growing up communist, just so our audience can follow where we are going with this, part 1 will be Mary's story about growing up in Ukraine, and part 2 will be more about how communism left the country feeling and left the people feeling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to provide some history, Mary, can you explain for people who don't totally understand communism, what is communism and how did it leave Ukraine in poverty? Because in theory, communism shouldn't leave a country in poverty.
That's
it should
right.
be equal for everybody, and everybody should have equal rights to everything. So how did this happen? How did it leave Ukraine in poverty?
The first thing about the communism is you want to build the empire, or you want to build a life by excluding God out of it. When you take God out of the story, you just don't succeed, because God is the creator, the beginning of a beginning, and you just can't take God out. So the theory, the ideology of communism is absolutely amazing. It's really built on the biblical principles. It's caring for others, sharing your wealth with others. It's being respectful to elderly. It's working hard. It's earning your bread. It really is an incredible ideology, but when you want to prove in that you can build it without God, you just don't succeed. Yeah.
So then how did Ukraine end up in poverty because of that?
Well, that's what happened, because you don't have God's hand that is blessing you. So anything you do, it just doesn't really prosper. Like For example, what the communists tried to do, they came in and took everything that belonged, like let's say they showed up to a farmer who owned a lot of acreage of a land and had animals and raised animals or whatever. They would come in, take it all away from him, and then everything became everyone's and no one's at the same time. So people that were lazy or didn't care to work hard, it empowered them to continue to do so, but the people that work hard to earn and to get ahead were discouraged to do that, because it didn't matter how hard you worked, you always stayed on the same level.
Right.
And only few that were in power, they were the ones that were benefiting. So you start seeing the injustice and unfairness, and you just get discouraged, and then everybody just sits and does nothing really.
Right. So in theory, it should make everybody's life better, but in reality, it was very discouraging and probably built up a lot of resentment between the people who are driven and the people who just wanted to ride off the coattails of.
Yeah, and it's exactly what it created.
Yeah, interesting. So what was it like for you growing up? Tell us a bit about your family. How many siblings do you have?
I grew up in a big family. I have 12 siblings, and honestly, I actually really, really loved it. I loved growing up in the big family. All of my siblings, we really enjoyed having each other, play with each other, fight with each other. You know, we had our own soccer team. If we wanted to play soccer, we could do that. It was a lot of fun growing up.
Yeah.
And we had an extremely loving mom and dad. We never felt like we were lacking love or attention from them. We just loved it.
Where did you fall in the 13 siblings?
I am in the middle.
Like right in the middle?
Yeah, I'm 6.
Mary the peacekeeper.
I don't know that, but yeah.
And what did your parents do?
Well, they did a lot of things. We lived in a small town or a village, almost like a little bit of a bigger village, and we had our own land. We had our own cows and pigs and chickens and ducks and raised our own meat. So my mom worked, and dad worked a lot on the garden. Us as kids, we had to work pretty hard actually on the gardens, and there was no tractors or anything like that, so everything was a hand labor. So it was a lot of work, but we had fun, and sometimes we hated it. So that's what that was our biggest sustainability, was our gardens and our animals that we raised. My dad did a lot of different jobs,
Right. Explain. We were talking about this before. Explain why he had so many different jobs, because this ties into how communism manifested in Ukraine.
Because my dad was a Christian, and he wasn't just kind of like sit back kind of a Christian. He was extremely enthusiastic. He was extremely charismatic, very influential Christian, like among youth or young adults, married couples, young couples. He was not very welcomed by the Communist Party in our province. So he was on the KGB list.
Sorry, can I pause for a second? For our viewers who don't know, what is the KGB? And what is the KGB?
It's like a secret, not a secret service, but it's kind of like an FBI equivalent to FBI. It's people that, trying to keep us safe and get rid of dangerous people in the society. And my dad happened to be on the list of those people. So because he was on the priority list with KGB, every time he would apply for a job, he would get accepted. But then as soon as they would find out, his name would pop up, he would get fired. So the shortest time that he held one job was 1 day. But usually it was 3 days or a couple months or so. So he was changing a lot of jobs. because of that.
How did he provide for the family for 13 kids? How did he do that?
You know what? It came to the point where just living off the garden and off the animals was not enough, because you had bills to pay. And even though mom would do a lot of things in the garden and grow and sell, it was not enough. So for 17 years, after a while, for 17 years, mom and dad both would travel to Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania. Those were 3 countries that were a part of USSR, and they worked there for 3 months at the time, or 4. So mom would take the youngest kids with her. My grandma quit her job, and she would look after all the farm and all the rest of us. And dad and mom would work. Dad did the construction. He had a big construction team that he was managing. And they also did the the field work. He also had probably about 35 people that he would take with him. Some were Christian, some were not. People that couldn't get a job in Ukraine, and he would take them along, and that's what they did for 17 years.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's intense. That's a lot of traveling around with 13 kids. And the fact that he was on like the equivalent of the FBI hit list just for being a Christian. Mm-hmm. What were some of the rules of communism that put your family in a difficult position as Christians?
So if you were a Christian, but you were kind of not undercover Christian, but kind of just common, kind of a Christian, but not really going out there and speaking about what you believe or trying to convert other people into Christianity, you were totally okay. You know, and you would not necessarily put on your resume that you were a Christian. You would probably hold a job and not worry about it. But my dad just wasn't a quiet Christian.
When you're the Billy Graham in Ukraine,
well, not quite.
You don't keep such a low profile, hey?
He just couldn't keep quiet. He just couldn't keep quiet about God and what he believed and the truth, and it just got him in trouble.
How so?
He was very likable. I don't know why, but young people really liked him. They loved his charisma, his enthusiasm. So he would always do these conferences or youth rallies in the woods and then get busted. But people would show up, like 100, 200 people would show up to these rallies. So, of course, it was a threat. It was a threat to communism, because you would have all these young people now starting to convert, probably.
Right.
And, they just didn't like him.
And you had mentioned that like a penalty for being caught hosting these gatherings or whatever would be the equivalent of 1 month's wage, right? Mm-hmm. Like KGB would come to your house and then, actually, let's backtrack for a second. Yeah. You guys going to school. Mm-hmm. That seemed to be a bit problematic for your dad getting busted a bit, because the teachers because he was on the hit list, mm-hmm. they would come and question you guys about who's been at your house, because you're not allowed to meet, right? Mm-hmm. Do you want to explain a bit about that, how that played out? Like mm-hmm. how would that go over?
So if you were a very influential leader, a Christian, you were not allowed to meet with other Christian people. Even if you were just meeting for nothing, just kind of hang out, mm-hmm. you were not allowed to do that. So because my dad still would do that sometimes, secretly at night, whatever, and the KGB knew it, because they knew, because things, would grow, or church would start growing, or youth, more youth would attend a church. So they knew that was dad's doing. So after a while, what they decided to do is to actually use us kids. So I was about 7 years of age, and the principal would come to our classroom, and they would call me out and ask who was in your house. And I knew I shouldn't lie. I knew that was wrong to lie. And I would hesitate for a second, and as soon as I would hesitate, she knew that somebody was there, and she would just say, if you are not going to say who was in your house, we're going to send your dad to White Bears, which we knew that was Siberia. And we knew there were people, Christian dads, that were in prison and that were sent to Siberia. So, of course, I was very afraid. And you just spill all the beans.
And then they would show up at your...
And then the dad would get the notice from the city hall with the penalty, or the KGB would show up, and the penalty would be equivalent to his monthly salary. And then, when we got older, then we kind of would just resist and not say anything or whatever. So later on, what the KGB decided, they decided that they are going to hire a spy on our family and also bug the house. But
they bugged your house?
They did, yeah. But the guy that put the bug on the house, he really loved my dad and he really respected my dad. So he just called my dad and said, I just want you to know. He was actually he was our neighbor, few houses down, this guy. And he just told my dad, I bugged your house. You have to keep your radio on 24/7 so the waves would interfere.
Oh.
We never knew it. I was already married, way into marriage, when Dad told us all these stories about the bug and the spy. Yeah, we just didn't know it.
Well, that guy wasn't a very good KGB agent.
So we just had a radio on, and I could never understand, why does my dad has a radio on at night? Like, you wake up at night and there's somebody's talking, and he just constantly had a radio on.
Did you know who the spies were?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't know. I didn't know. He was later on, like I said, I was already married when Dad told us these stories. None of us kids knew. We were not aware of Dad's being on a KGB list, or we just didn't know it.
Right.
Dad and Mom never prayed about it in front of us. They never discussed it. We thought we were safe, the safest you can be. So we were never feeling a threat or hiding or any of it.
Right.
They just talked about it between themselves, I guess, or I don't know. But it never came out. So we never knew it. It's just later on, like I said, when the communists collapsed, and I was way into my marriage when Dad shared. So the spy guy, Dad never knew about. He himself came and admitted to Dad a few years before he passed away. And it was probably, I would say, about 15 years ago that he came and admitted to Dad.
Wow.
He was the nicest guy. He lived on the next street from us, always riding a bike, and we loved him as kids. He was just this nicest guy. He would give us a candy, and candy was quite a scarce thing back then. And he would give us candy and stop in the yard and talk with us. And he always seemed under the influence a little.
Okay.
But sometimes he would just show up in our house like at 10 p.m. out of nowhere, not even knocking at the door. So usually, if you had people sitting in the house, he would see exactly who was there. But we never knew that was him, because he was just such a kind, nice guy. So
he was a good spy.
he was a good spy. And then later on, he came to Dad and he was crying and admitted he became quite a heavy drinker and alcoholic. He actually did die from alcohol. But he came and told my dad, crying and asking forgiveness, that he's so sorry, but that he did that. But that was him who would then tell on Dad, because Dad and Mom would try to figure out, like, who told on them. How could people know exactly who was in the room and exactly what time, so precise. And right.
I'm backtracking a little bit because it's a good story of your parents' wedding. And so, like, we've been talking about how under communism, Christians can't meet, can't have conferences or gatherings. So how did they do that?
Yeah, so
one way would be
my dad
wedding.
Actually wasn't from the same province where that my mom is from. He was from a different province, and he actually came to this province, Western province, as a missionary to work with youth and young adults. So as soon as he arrived to our province, he got on this KGB list because he started doing all these rallies in the woods and all that, like I said. So when my dad decided to marry Mom, proposed to Mom, and on their wedding day, the KGB actually shut down all the public transportation. All the roads were barricaded into the town where they were getting married, because they knew my dad was going to invite all these different people. And like I said, dad knew quite a few people in Ukraine, so he was inviting all these speakers and all that. They were going to use their wedding as an opportunity for Christians to get together and pray and have this big conference. So it was interesting because Dad outsmarted them. Dad was pretty smart, actually. They borrowed a boat from somebody, like a little boat, and they brought people across the river into the village. So that's how my dad ended up having what he wanted.
Right.
A huge, I think they had about 1,200 people attending
Wow.
the wedding. And the interesting thing also was that he had an agent. He had an actual KGB agent assigned to him. So
To attend the wedding.
to attend in general, but
Right.
also that agent was to attend the wedding.
Oh, okay.
So this lady came to the wedding, to the reception, and at the end of the wedding, she actually gave her life to the Lord. And I remember when us kids, like
Unreal.
us even growing up, she became a babushka, then we called her, and we always visited her. She always visited us. We just loved her. She was just like a part of a family, a member of a family.
Right.
So that's kind of where
Your dad's a sneaky guy.
he was a sneaky guy.
So, did you have a Bible growing up?
I was way much older. I think I can't exactly say how old I was, but I was in my teenage years when I got my first Bible, and it was actually even in Russian. It's just recently, a few years ago, that I switched to Ukrainian because we couldn't even get Ukrainian back then.
Okay.
Ukrainian Bibles. But my dad had a Bible. At some point it was allowed to have one Bible per family. So my
Okay.
dad had a Bible, but my dad also had a lot of books, worship books, songs, notes, and some Christian books. It was very scarce. It was hard to get. It was all contraband that the foreigners would sneak into the country, right? Because it's not like now you can just go and purchase a Christian book. So my dad had few, but speaking of it too, our house would get searched at times by KGB. They would come and search your home. So the lady that lives right across from us, still to this day, she was a secretary at the city hall, at the KGB office. And she loved and respected my mom and dad. So she would come to Dad and say, just so you're aware, tomorrow in such and such time, you are going to get, your house is going to get checked. And my dad would take all his books and bring it to her house. We never knew that either.
No way.
But that was so incredible to find this out, like 18 years ago, to find all these stories. Yeah, she just loved my dad so much, and my mom, and respected them, that though she was herself a communist member, you had to be, in order to work in any of those jobs, you had to be a member of Communist Party. She just didn't really believe the ideology. And you know, through this, it's just incredible to me to see it's a God story, you know. It's
100%.
a God's provision, God's protection. God always finds the way to equip us to do what he chooses us to do for his kingdom. And you know, we don't have to worry about safety or provision or anything else, because if God Almighty chooses us for a certain task, which is a privilege really, he just provides. He just makes the way.
And he provides angels.
And he provides, angels in the...
Like the lady across the road who warned your dad about the search.
Yeah.
I think she's an angel.
Yeah, she is, definitely.
Were you persecuted, or was your family, okay, we've kind of established, yes, there's an element of persecution for being a Christian. I'll reword that question. How were you persecuted, as you personally and your siblings?
You know, persecution is a really strong word.
Sure.
And I feel like being persecuted, it's like, you know, you are beaten and imprisoned. So really, in comparison to some kids that had Christian dads and moms, and their dads were taken to prison and sent to Siberia, and they grew up without dad for 10, 15 years or even 20 years or most of their life because of dad's belief. We didn't experience that. We had dad that loved us. We had mom with us. They were loving us, tucking us at night. And those kids didn't have it. So I have a hard time saying that I was persecuted. Were we bullied? Yeah.
Okay.
We were
That's a better word
bullied.
then.
You know, made fun of that. Oh, look at them. They believe in God. Show us the God. Like, you know, let's see how far they get with their beliefs and things like that. So, you know, when you were 7 or 8 and you were in the classroom with 31 other pupils, it's pretty humiliating to take, and a principal or a teacher is telling those things about you. It was hard to take. Or, you know, if you chose not to have a Lenin star, which was an ideology, was Leninism, and Marxism and Leninism ideology is a part of a communism.
Okay.
And, you know, to be a follower of this ideology, when you were very young, you would have a red star with the Lenin's face. Well, we refused to have that because we believed in God. So to have a teacher pinning it on you every morning you come to school and then you taking it off and you know, getting slapped at, that was also, and it was hard for us as kids because you thought, like, I believe a little bit differently, but you are punished for it. But on the other hand, you couldn't really choose it because it was what your family believed, and you were 7 years of age.
Right.
You didn't really know what
It's hard to
believe.
understand for a 7-year-old.
Yeah. So that was hard. Or, you know, being threatened by a principal that, you know, if you don't say what's happening in your house and what your dad is doing or you know, what he's teaching you or whatever, your dad is going to be taken away and sent to Siberia. So then you are scared always for the life of your dad, and you're always fearful when the principal approaches, not necessarily you, but you always felt like, oh my word, what are they going to tell today? What are they going to ask me today? We were blessed that academically we were all of us were more or less pretty good at school. So we had a lot of teachers that liked us and were for us and were defending us. So
Again, angels.
yeah, so that was a blessing, really was. But, you know, you take a music school we wanted to attend. We were not allowed to. We were, you know, too bullied for it. And so we couldn't really go to music schools or anything. But my dad was self-taught musician. He's played a lot of instruments. So he taught us all how to play instruments. And we sang all the time. And it was good.
I like the story of you guys thinking it was a game to jump into the bushes when on your way to like a Christmas service or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Well, when the KGB would pass.
Yeah.
That's what, Mary, why don't you tell the story, what your parents would tell you to do?
So during communism, there was no such thing on a calendar as Christmas or Easter. Those words didn't even exist. Obviously, in the church, we were celebrating Jesus, his birth, Easter. Those were huge holidays. So, of course, you want to make it to those celebrations. And usually, unless it was Sunday, you always had school on those days. So it wasn't like, oh, it's Christmas Day, it's a holiday. Unless it was Sunday, that was a holiday. So the church would hold a service really late into the night, like when it was dark outside and all that. So we as kids, I mean, there was a lot of us, and Dad had a vehicle, but it was a small one. So lots of us had to walk. And we would just go to church to celebrate Christmas. And, you know, you could see there, literally on every corner of the streets, there were a teacher or a principal or KGB or a government official. And they also, there was only few cars back then. It wasn't like as many cars as now, only few. So you knew, and KGBs, they had their own type of cars. So you could see the car approaching, and we would just jump in the ditch. And when we all finally end up in the church, we were just like, well, we weren't high-fiving each other because we didn't do it back then. But we were just hugging each other like, yay,
We won.
we won. Did you see how many? I passed this many. And the principal in the corner and my teacher, math teacher. And
It
we
sounds
just
like,
thought it was so much fun.
yeah, it sounds like your parents did such an amazing job at keeping fear under the radar for you as kids. They didn't talk about it. Yeah, they never made you feel bad if you ratted them out.
Yeah.
What a blessing to have parents who
Yes.
protected you from
It
that.
is. It is really like I never knew.
Yeah.
We never knew what danger we were in ever.
You didn't even know that you grew up in like poor.
No,
Yeah.
we didn't know that. I mean, Dad and Mom believe, their beliefs till even now is that you have to work hard to have enough for yourself and to give. Dad taught us to work hard, to enjoy doing what you're doing, to do everything as you would do to a Lord. Feel that it's a privilege, understand that it's a privilege to be able to earn. Not everybody has an opportunity and the chance, and you do. And yeah, he just taught us that. He did that himself. Him and Mom lived it out. And so we were, for Ukraine, we were middle class. So
Interesting. Under communism, there
under
was
communism, we were
classes.
actually a middle
Yeah.
class. Like, you know what? Majority of kids didn't have what we had. We didn't have a lot. Like my first dress that actually was my own, that was purchased for me, I think I was like 12. Everything else was just passed down from my older sister. Mom would resew it, fit it, make it fit my size. So,
Right.
but I never thought I was poor. We had all the needs, all our needs were met. You know, I don't even remember. We didn't have any toys. Like I didn't grow up with toys or anything, but we just played in the mud and sticks and
as kids should.
as kids, yeah.
Yeah.
And we just loved it. Played with animals, you know. I
So
don't know.
when did communism fall?
The communists fall it started in 1989, 92. That's when it was the collapse.
Okay. So at that point, were you able to receive humanitarian aid, or was that even before?
No, because before communist collapse, there was really, we never met foreigners. I've never seen a foreigner in my life.
Right. You called it the Iron Wall.
It was an iron wall, an iron curtain, and it
Right.
literally was an iron curtain. Like it's so funny because even thinking that people that would listen to Beatles, that was so not allowed.
Really?
Like even to have a foreign music, it was a contraband to get those kind of songs. Even for people that were secular people, not even Christians, if they had a little bit of different ideology than communists, they were persecuted as well. It wasn't just Christians. So if you talk about Disney or Hollywood or movies or whatever, we had zero concept
yeah.
of it because it was never taught, it was never talked about. We didn't know anything. All we knew was about USSR, about communism. We were studying Leninism and Marxist ideology. We didn't even really know the true history of Ukraine until communists failed. So I went to school and I graduated without even knowing the truth about Holocaust and the persecution or any of it.
Wow. That's crazy. So this is the last question for part one, and you kind of answered it, but how did your upbringing shape your priorities today?
Yeah, Dad and Mom live out what they believed. It wasn't so much that they were teaching us. Dad especially would take a Bible, read it for us, and teach, from it and teach us. But he lived it. Him and Mom really lived what it means. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind, with all your strength. We saw it. We saw it the way they were praying. They would take time to read the Bible, though in the business that we were, you always could see them reading the Bible. Always praying. It's one thing that our household always did. Dad and Mom always did. You were coming, going, leaving, whatever that was, they always prayed for us, over us, constantly. I don't remember ever going to school without Mom praying for me. So it was something that was so normal for us to grow up in, and worship, singing was a huge thing that Dad and Mom were doing. They would sing a duet together, even in the evenings in our house. So then as we grew up, we would join in. And so loving God was such a huge part of my mom and Dad's life, which, kind of shapes you too. Yeah. And then the second one was working hard, having enough for yourself and enough to share with others. And always, 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 Mom and Dad gave. Always. I don't ever remember somebody coming to our house and asking for something, neighbors, because that's what people do in Ukraine. If you're short on this or on that or whatever, you come and borrow or just ask. Or we would have Romas, gypsies coming. Mom always gave something, always. And I would sometimes get so mad because you would have like 4 or 5 people in the row coming and asking. I'd be like, Mom. And she would always say, Mary, you never withhold your hand from the one that asks. And that was a huge thing. To give was one of the probably second most important thing that Mom and Dad taught us. They didn't just preach it. They pretty much never even had to preach it. We just saw them do that. Hospitality was a huge thing. Back then, during USSR, there was no hotels or restaurants or anything. So people, when they would travel, they would just stop at somebody's house. And because my dad was pretty known, somebody that knew Dad would give his address. And our door was always unlocked. All the time, my whole life, our yard gates were open and the door was unlocked. And it's a true story. Like, we would wake up in the middle of the night, go to the bathroom, and you would have all these people that you didn't know laying on the ground.
Really?
Yeah, just sleeping because they were traveling through somewhere. The biggest group that we ever hosted was 82 people in our house. At one time. It was like, it was bodies everywhere, on couches, on the floors, and in the hallways, in the kitchen. It was just...
Wow.
Yeah, it was some group traveling from somewhere and they had to stop. And
82 people.
Yeah, so...
Here's a cornflake for you.
Yeah.
Here's a cornflake for you.
And you know what? Mom always had a spread. Mom fed gas better than... Well, I shouldn't say she fed gas better than us. We were never hungry. But like anything that was better off, like meat was pretty scarce when we grew up. Even now, not many people can afford it.
Yeah.
Mom would always give the best to the guest. And I used to be so mad, and Mom would always say, you never know, you might be entertaining the angels. Yeah. So, yeah, that's shaped me, right? Yeah. Because you see it, you grew up with it, and it's almost a natural. Yeah. You just become that kind of, right? And I'm trying to pass it on to Tatiana.
Yeah.
The importance of having God number one, having... people around you, number 2, and then giving and caring for others and just enjoying life and making the best out of what you have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very evident as I'm listening to your whole story. I've heard snippets here and there. Mary's a really good storyteller. I feel like we should get her back for part 4, 5, and 6. But it's just so evident God's hand in your family's life. And because they welcomed it and they asked for it, and God provided, and he took care of them, he took care of you. And it's a very, very cool story. So for part 1, I want to end it there. And the closing point, which I wanted to say just to kind of lead us into part 2 for another day, is understanding, like, in order to have compassion for people, like we have a lot of Ukrainian projects from Hungry for Life that Mary runs. But in order to have compassion, you have to understand context and where people come from. What did their life look like? How did their upbringing shape them today? And then go in and ask, how can you help? So Mary provided a really great and vivid picture of her upbringing and the hardships that they faced and the joys that they faced, and what the people in Ukraine faced under the communist government. And it puts us in a place of knowing now. And on part 2, we'll talk about what we do with what we know now and where to go from there. How is Ukraine today, and all that kind of stuff, and more of Mary's stories. So stay tuned. Also, I conned Mary into providing a little gift for a giveaway for this podcast, which will be a dozen of Mary's Ukrainian authentic pierogies.
Yes, you are welcome.
We will explain how you can win those when we post this up on our social media. So, Mary, thank you for sharing a bit about your family and your upbringing, and thanks for doing part 2 next time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's it.
Thanks for listening to What in the World, where we seek to educate and inspire. Here at Hungry for Life, we are passionate about your group having a global impact and eradicating needless suffering. For more information, head over to our website at hungryforlife.org. And you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and wherever you may listen to podcasts. Tune in every other week for another conversation about what is happening at Hungry for Life.